Welcome in to another edition of Professor Zeeb's Developmental Psychology Lectures. I am Professor Zeeb, and today we're going to talk about a really touchy, sensitive topic. We're going to talk about the sexual behavior of adolescents. So guys, if you have a kiddo in the room, I'm going to recommend at this time to have them leave the room. So go ahead and pause the video and allow your child to leave the room. Go ahead and do that now. All right, so hopefully there's no kiddos in the room. We're going to talk about a lot of adult, touchy, sensitive stuff, okay, as we talk about the sexual behavior of adolescents. So keep in mind that we know that adolescents are dealing with this newly found sexual experience in terms of the reproductive system kicking into overdrive and becoming sexual and dating and so forth. So it goes to follow that teenagers are going to experiment with sex and get involved in sexual type relationships and behaviors. Unfortunately, there's some heavy duty consequences of those, which we're going to discuss. All right, so let's get right into it here. We're going to talk about the sexual behavior of teens. Okay, so we're going to look at some studies and different findings related to the sexual behavior of teens here. All right, we'll start off with some research. So it turns out that many adolescents are sexually active. You know, for example, masturbation would be a common sexual outlet for adolescents, especially for a 14-year-old boy, if you kind of think about that. So we would almost expect that, you know, it's a time of experimentation and discovery in terms of sex and things like that. So we would expect teenagers to at least think about this, if not perform in those acts. In the past 2 decades, sexual activity among adolescents has declined. So why do you think that is? Why do you think these numbers have been going down, certainly since the 90s? Well, we think, and by the way, that also includes having sex with multiple people. The obvious answer is the fear of STDs and the educational research that's out there. So once again, we think a lot of teens are feeling the pressure from education and society to have protected sex, but also worrying about getting AIDS, getting STIs, teenage pregnancy, of course, those kind of things we think are really been factoring in, and we're seeing those numbers decline. That being said, however, some research is showing that compared to previous generations, it's happening at earlier and earlier ages. Remember, we said that some of that could be attributed to the secular trend, the stuff that we've talked about before, was covered before in the chapter. But let's look at some research findings here. So this study comes out of 2015. It found that 58% of 12th graders or seniors had reported that they had participated in intercourse. So over half of those people in the study. 24% of 9th graders also admitted that they had had intercourse. So nearly a quarter of our 14-year-olds, 9th graders had admitted this in the study. Looking at some ethical consideration or ethnic considerations, excuse me, we have found that the Asian population, American Asians, are the ones that are reporting to have sex for the first time later, whereas African Americans are more likely to engage in sex at earlier ages than any other ethnic group. So we do see some differences among ethnic groups according to those studies. When it comes to something like oral sex, we have found that definitely teenagers are participating in this. It seems to be a very common occurrence in our US teens. So according to the study in 2015, ages 15 to 19, 51% of males in that study admitted that they'd had participated in oral sex, where girls, it was about 47% of them admitted in the study. So either way you look at it, male or female, nearly half, if you look at those numbers, had admitted in the study that they had participated in oral sex while still being a minor or a teenager. Late teen in this particular case, but a teen nevertheless. Here's what's kind of a shocking finding in terms of the stuff, and something you have to kind of consider, is that when we ask teens about their sexual behavior, many adolescents do not think they're actually having sex if their physical acts stop short of actual intercourse. Do you guys understand the irony and the dangerous nature of that? I mean, that's incredible. For example, is oral sex a sexual act? Some teens feel that if it does not go to full-on intercourse, they're not having sex. You guys understand the madness involved in that. You can still get an STI from oral sex. It doesn't mean that you're immune to that. So even things that may not be intercourse specifically are obviously still sexual and can lead to consequences, unfortunately. Okay, so I thought that was interesting. All right, some other research concerning athletes. They found some differences in athletes between male and female athletes. Female athletes are less likely to be sexually active than their non-athletic counterparts. So I thought that was interesting, as well as risk-taking, according to the study cited in 2016 by Lepowski and others. However, when we look at the male athlete, we find it's almost the opposite. So we're finding that male athletes are really, one of the populations that seem to be participating in sex a lot compared to the female athletes. So I thought that was really interesting. All right, so next we're going to look at some factors related to sexual risk-taking behavior. Research has found some correlates or risk factors that seem to kind of play out here. Remember, it's correlational data once again. All right, having low parental supervision is associated with more risk-taking in terms of sex. That makes sense because it's less constriction of behavior. So let's say that we have parents that are always working or never home and are not watching their teens or supervising, monitoring that kind of stuff. We have found that that may be a recipe for disaster in terms of the stuff where their teenagers are participating in sexual activity. In fact, studies have also shown that good supportive parenting, which obviously I'm going to recommend at many levels, is related to lower risk-taking sexually. So it seems to be the kids that have a lot of time on their hands and are not being supervised or monitored by their parents are the ones that are participating in these sexual acts. Remember, this is dangerous because it could lead to potentially STIs. It could lead to a teenage pregnancy situation. So once again, there are some consequences of that. Low SES populations are the ones that report the highest risk or highest rate of risk-taking behavior when it comes to sex. There's probably many different reasons you could argue for that, but the one that pops into my mind immediately is that they're probably less educated. In other words, they're not educated about the dangers of this. Maybe no one's ever told them this could actually happen in a certain way. So there's probably a lot of different moving parts there to kind of consider, but to me, that seems like the most prevalent in my opinion. Having a sexually active older sibling. So research has also determined that if you have an older brother or sister who are sexually active and are participating in these acts, you're probably more likely to do so yourself. Remember, we said that kids often learn through imitation and modeling. So that would make sense if they're looking up to their older brother and sister, they're role models for them, and they're telling them about their experiences or they overhear it kind of thing. It may influence them to want to participate in those activities themselves. So that would kind of make sense. Finally, having a low connectedness to school. Remember, school often have programs in these particular areas, especially like in high schools as an example. So we know that not being connected to school could be problematic. So once again, this is linked to less positive sexual outcomes, not being connected to school and those enriching in programs that schools often have in relation to these types of things. So studies have also found that connection. All right, so now we're going to look at one of the consequences of teenage sexual behavior, and that of course is teen pregnancy. All right, so we're going to look at some factors. By the way, our country, the United States, has one of the highest rates in the world of teenage pregnancy. So I thought that was interesting, okay? About half of these pregnancies result in a live birth, so only about half, where about a third of them will result in an abortion, and then about a sixth of them will result in a miscarriage. So about half, roughly, if you look at the numbers, actually make it to a live birth, according to the research here. Typically, it's an unmarried mother, not always, but typically it would be someone who's not married yet, who is now forced into this potentially by themselves. And we also have discovered that the rates of teenage pregnancy have been declining. So that's good news. We're gonna look at some data here. So down here we have the year, and then birth rate per 1,000 of 15 to 19-year-olds. You can see around the 90s, there was this sort of spiking of teenage pregnancies in this population, 15 to 19. And then if we look at the past 20 years or so, it has been declining. So that's good news. Those rates have been going down. Once again, probably because of fear of STIs or STDs, better education. So we're a lot better at informing young people about the dangers of this. And then of course, contraception, more contraception use that's really being pushed in the media and out there in the public, that you should be, practicing safe sex, using condoms and things like that. So obviously that would trickle down to some of these findings. So when you look at it, 90s, we saw this sort of huge influx of teenage pregnancies, but it's been going down in recent decades there, okay? Okay, going back to teenage pregnancy, what are some reasons why this happens? And by the way, when we look at the numbers, when we look at ethnic populations, we find that Latino females have one of the highest rates of this, the highest chance of becoming pregnant as a teenager compared to African Americans and the Caucasian population. So the research is showing some difference in terms of ethnic considerations, all right? But let's look at some other factors. So risk factors for becoming pregnant as a teenager. Living in poverty. Now keep in mind, guys, as we go through these are not always true. So I don't want to, make the point that these always play out. Once again, correlational data, there's always exceptions. But living in poverty is a risk factor. Growing up in a single parent household. Being a daughter of a teenage mother. To me, in my personal life and in my opinion, that rings true. I can think of several examples of that in my own life. So the research has confirmed that this is a risk factor, a correlational risk factor, that being a daughter of a teenage mother may be enough to create a risk factor in the daughter themselves of becoming pregnant as a teen. Having a sexual abuse history, so people who come from that background, unfortunately, which is a horrible, terrible thing, are more likely to become pregnant as a teenager. Having siblings who are sexually active. Notice the ties to the stuff that we were talking about before with sexual behavior and risk factors. Not good students before the pregnancy. So in other words, they found a trend of young females who are not doing so hot in school. We see this sort of consistent factor where their grades have been plummeting or they're just not doing well. That is a greater risk factor than students who are excelling in school. So I thought that was kind of interesting there. Okay, so here's some reasons why teenage pregnancy happens other than the obvious. Remember, a lot of these young women or young girls are making poor decisions about sex. I mean, that probably goes without saying. Even though we have so many programs that are designed to prevent this, and we have started to see the decline, as we said before, there still are some reasons out there why this is happening. So this first one is getting pregnant for psychological, social reasons. Let me sort of explain that. In some cases, we find that some young females may purposely get pregnant or try to get pregnant for recognition. Maybe that's absent in their life. They don't have a strong social life. They're not popular. Maybe they're just kind of this person who doesn't have a lot of friends, for example. But when they become pregnant, now everyone's talking about them and they're getting attention that ordinarily they would not get. So it's kind of a twisted reason for wanting to get pregnant, in my opinion. And yet there it is. Some girls may possibly do this to get that recognition, to become popular, to be looked at as more mature, for example. Those are some of the reasons why you could argue that. In other words, this may be a way of getting recognition, but also becoming an adult. I mean, obviously a very drastic way of becoming an adult if their education and career avenues are unavailable. So maybe they have no options. And so they've decided that this is my identity. I want to be a parent, and this is going to be my rite of passage into the real world as a parent, as an adult. So there you go. All right, let's look at some other information here. Unfortunately, there's a lot of negative outcomes that are linked to teenage pregnancy. Let's take a look at those. Depression. Okay, so that's associated with being a teen parent. Dropping out of school. So obviously both of those have their own consequences. Okay, so dropping out of school. And then unfortunately, the effects economically. So having to care and provide for an infant when you're young and you don't necessarily have a good job or a good provider in that sense, like if the parents aren't in the picture, the boyfriend's not in the picture, economically it could be kind of drastic for that family, that new family. Research also shows that unfortunately, teenage mothers may never catch up to those who are not pregnant, those who do not become pregnant as a teen. So in other words, not only does it set you back in the beginning because you're having to care for this infant, which by the way, babies are very expensive, as some of you know, but research also shows that they may never quite catch up economically to people who did it other ways, where they were an adult when they became pregnant and planned it out and that kind of thing. All right. So that will kind of conclude our lecture. A lot to kind of think about there. A very important topic, obviously. So hopefully I have now educated you in that sort of sense. So please continue to the next part of the class. I hope you're enjoying the lectures, and we'll see you online.